If I known the screen was going to be this big, I would have chosen some really cool, shocking images of some fields. The scale may be off. The slides aren't that interesting. Mostly to keep me on track.
So we were conferring. Michael, I'm going to do just a very quick
All
introduction.
yours.
I don't know if you've already introduced yourself,
No.
but Michael is a professor of English at Emory University and also recently appointed as Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, correct?
Interim.
I see. I see. Yes, and I had the opportunity to meet Michael this summer at a discussion about open access monographs. And this was a discussion that was attended by publishers as well as librarians and faculty and administrators. And the conversation evolved in a way so that I began to understand that Michael was very interested in some of the things that we have been interested in terms of the Mellon project of publishing digital monographs, especially monographs that have a great deal of digital content in them beyond just a PDF or kind of what looks like a book still. So I've been very impressed by all of the work that you've done, especially the preparation in talking with your faculty and kind of helping them understand what this new landscape is and how they might fit in it. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure. And thank you, Harriet, so much for the invitation. And just thanks to all of you for being here as we enter into the end game of the semester. I am really pleased to be here, especially I'm thrilled to have this kind of screen. The screen itself is more than worth the trip. But also I'm really excited to be here because I feel like I've actually been quite in dialogue with what all has been going on here at Brown over the years, even though I haven't been here physically. Your efforts have been one of the things that we've been paying attention to at Emory. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit at the end about the current grant that we have to support some of this work, and it's a grant that we formulated in part by work looking at what you all have been doing here in your Mellon-funded project. So it's great to make a virtual dialogue into a physical one, if only for a day. One of the things I'll be talking about are institutions and how we enact what we're trying to do as scholars in institutional contexts. And Brown and Emory do share some key similarities in terms of their size, in terms of their focus, but also because we don't have university presses on our campuses. And I think that shapes how these conversations evolve on a campus. So I'm going to be talking about some very specific things going on about developments in the monograph, especially in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. But I'd like to begin by just talking, for a moment a little bit more theoretically or abstractly about two terms that I think broadly frame these developments for me. And the terms are the humanities and the public. And of course, they're general terms. They get used in a lot of different ways. Humanities we talk about as being a mode of interpretation, a mode of attention to evidence, a privileging of documents and images, interest in language and culture and history. Humanities, of course, is a very administrative term also in the university today. And I was reading recently, sort of the humanities as an administrative term has really started to be used in the first half of the 20th century as a kind of umbrella term for those things that wouldn't fit into the natural and social sciences. So it's always been a kind of convenient placeholder. Now the humanities most frequently follows phrases like defense of and decline of, and I think that's important. And public, of course, is a very general term that we use in a lot of different ways, usually in distinction with something else, the private, to refer to things that are funded by the government, to refer to areas of discourse, and also to refer to a general population as opposed to a specialized specialized population. We've arrived at this moment now, I think, in the academy, where we feel that the relationship between the humanities and the public is not where we would like it to be. And I would say if there's one thing that humanists at this moment can agree upon, and if you're from the humanities faculty, you know that they agree upon very little, except a sense of their marginalization, is that there is this imperative and a need to speak to the public somehow. This is both important for the future of public life, but also to the future of the humanities. And I think everything that we're talking about today takes place in that context. And so I want to, again, to do a little bit of genealogy to think about how we arrived at this place. And for me, a useful way of thinking about this story is to go back 20 years ago to 1996. Like all genealogies, it's a personal as well as a general genealogy. This is a moment when I was in graduate school, and so of course, very alive to what was going on. But there are kind of two key publications that I think tell us a lot about where we are today from 1996 in the humanities and the public. And one of those publications is an article that some of you probably know about by Alan Sokal called Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a More Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Alan Sokal was a theoretical physicist, is a theoretical physicist, a mathematical physicist at NYU who published this article in Social Text, a kind of left-leaning journal of social theory, in which he made claims, the article pairs quotations from theoretical physicists, Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, with quotations from contemporary cultural theory. Judith Butler, Derrida plays a large role, and the article goes on to argue that, as the title suggests, that quantum gravity really fits nicely into kind of postmodern conceptions about the radical destabilization of truth. It includes, quotations like this. Here my aim is to carry deep analyses one step further by taking account for recent developments in quantum gravity, and it goes on to talk about Heisenberg and problematizing, relativizing, and so on. And the article was published in this very, again, prominent cultural studies journal. The problem was that Sokal meant none of it. He was a theoretical physicist who had kind of trolled quotations from what he thought were the excesses of the theoretical humanities, chopped them up and put them together with some quotations from the classic physics, and put them together in an argument that he said no respectable physicist would ever believe, no respectable mathematician would ever believe. And from his perspective, it was an elaborate kind of test to see if anybody was at home in the humanities, paying attention to the kinds of evidence that people were putting forward in the kind of postmodern theoretical work that was being published. And from his perspective, it was a test that the humanities failed, and failed badly. And this was a book that ended up being published by Lingua Franca, which was an important journal at the time, more like the Chronicle of Higher Education. But also this became written up in the New York Times. This was a great, there's nothing more than that the media loves than kind of academics acting foolishly, especially when they get in a kind of circular firing squad. And so this was a kind of small media event. And I think it's an important one. I think what this did was it pushed the humanities kind of back into an academic circle. This was coming after years of New York Times articles featuring star humanists, featuring theorists. This was a moment when the humanities had been through the canon wars and the culture wars. And the Sokal hoax was a kind of marked a moment when there was a return to a more inward academic discourse. It sent, I think, a strong message that if you put yourself too far out there, especially if you're doing a certain kind of humanistic work, you're really putting yourself at risk. So that's one thing that happened in 1996. Another publication that came out in 1996 is something that would not have even been considered a publication at the time. And that was the launch of the William Blake Archive. This is a contemporary screenshot. This is not the 1996 version of it, but you can see it actually still looks very much like a 1996 website. They've done lots of updates, but they've retained that early Web 1.0 aura about it. And the William Blake Archive, I have to tell you less about because it's a lot like every other textual archive that you know about, digital textual archive at this time. It does what we think a textual archive should do. It has authoritative editions of William Blake's texts, including, of course, his illuminated manuscripts, so it does some things that are hard to do in print. It was not the first textual archive of its kind, but it was one of the first to really be launched in the way that we now expect digital projects of this kind to be launched. It was sponsored by the kind of federal institutions that have played a large role in the digitization of texts in the humanities. It featured the kinds of partnerships that now are required to take things like this forward in terms of a partnership between Blake scholars and computer scientists skilled in textual markup. It included the kinds of project teams, including graduate students, many of whom went on to become leaders in what we now think of as the digital humanities. In fact, you might think of this as this is the beginning of that turn from humanities computing to digital humanities. Matthew Kirschenbaum, who's a very important figure right now in the digital humanities, was actually the project manager in the development of this. And one of the things that's interesting about this project, and Matthew Kirschenbaum has written about this, is that from the very beginning, this was understood as a resource for humanities scholars, but also for other audiences as well. For educators, K through 12 educators, but also for a public of readers interested in William Blake who might not find themselves in any educational institution at all. And interestingly, when this was first launched, and Matt Kirschenbaum has written about this, this site got into kind of some wars with fan sites of Blake, really kind of early AOL fan sites that were put up, and emerged victorious, right? So this is the idea of, remember back when we think the web would democratize knowledge, right? This is the beginning of that kind of push. So if you think about these two things together as both transpiring about 20 years ago, you could think about them as being indicative of two very different kinds of humanistic scholarship, but also two very different kinds of relationships to the public, right? On the one hand, Social Text article is ridiculing a very kind of esoteric form of theoretical scholarship, very skeptical, very anti-foundational, and a kind of scholarship that would only, in the end, really find its audience among other academics. And then the Blake Archive is a very positivist, meaning, really kind of fact-based humanistic scholarship, establishing authoritative texts and introducing people to the work of interpretation, but very public-facing, right? About joining the academic audience together with the public. So this is a much more kind of outward trend. What I think is really interesting right now about our current moment is that these two streams of scholarship, public digital scholarship on the one hand, and then sort of academic focused scholarship that survives largely through print journals and print monographs, are beginning to converge again in really interesting ways. And they're beginning to converge in part because they're being driven by a set of scholarly and even institutional questions that a number of different actors have been asking for a while, but with real kind of force since 2008, since the recession. And the institutional actors include things like the AUP, the ARL, the AAU, as well as different kinds of professional societies. And they are big questions like, what is the future of scholarly publishing, both as an intellectual enterprise as well as a financial enterprise. And as a subset of that, right, how can university presses maintain their financial viability at a moment when the university subsidies are beginning to flatline or even be reduced? And of course, university presses are under tremendous financial pressure because of the book pricing model of Amazon.com and declining library purchases. And I imagine everybody in the room is familiar with that. As part of that, what is possible and desirable from the digital publication of monographs and long-form scholarship? How can we do this? Should we do this? What are the implications of that? And then the question that in some ways really for me began the involvement in this, and I'm sorry this is down low, is what would it mean if we move to a model of university funding for digital monographs? And this is the question that the ARL and AAU began asking, I think about 5 years ago, and then the Andrew Mellon Foundation picked up. And what the question was what would it mean if we shift both the model of distribution and financing for long-form scholarship in the humanities? Right? And I'm sorry, I know many of you are probably already familiar with what I'm talking about, but just in case somebody doesn't, you think about the way a book publication works now is the press pays for the costs of producing the book, or at least many of the production costs, and then recovers those costs through the sales of the book to libraries and individual readers. And some it makes a little bit of a profit, and most it shows a loss, and hopefully it balances out in the end. And the university that subsidizes that press helps make up that difference. In this model, universities like Emory and Brown are considered to be free riders because we're not contributing to the system by subsidizing university presses, which is necessary to make this whole system go. What Mellon and these other groups started asking a while ago is, what if the model were that the university where the scholar resides actually pays for most of, or at least a very large percentage of, the publication costs, and instead of recouping those costs through publication, the costs are paid for upfront, and then the product is distributed as an open access free digital product, possibly accompanied by print sales as well. What would that mean for all of these things, for the future of scholarly publishing? Is it a way to sustain university presses? Is it a way for the humanities to re-engage with the public in a new way? And that's kind of where I got involved in this conversation personally. And about 3 years ago, Mellon commissioned 2 studies, actually commissioned a third one too. The study I was obviously involved in was through Emory College, the College of Arts and Sciences at Emory University, which is a very faculty-oriented group. And then the same time they commissioned a study at the University of Michigan and the University of Indiana that also involved their university presses to think about how such a process would work there. They also commissioned a third study that probably should be on this slide with the Ithaca group to try to determine what the actual cost of producing a monograph is. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But what they sort of asked is this model a desirable model? And if it is, how would it actually work, and what would be the things that would need to be put in place? As it did this, it was making a series of grants to university presses to build new publishing infrastructure. So during the 2014-2015 academic year, these grants were being made and notices were being put up about these different initiatives. And you can't see here, Michigan, Minnesota, Indiana, Northwestern, are all being funded in different ways by Mellon to develop different kinds of infrastructure for publishing, in some ways, very different kinds of digital projects. So the Manifold Project, the University of Minnesota Press, the Stanford Interactive Scholarly Works Project, Stanford University Press, and so on. And I'll talk a little bit more about those at the end of the talk. What we did at Emory during the 14-15 academic year is we, as a group of faculty and with a few administrators, really got together and tried to wrestle with the questions that Mellon was asking. Is this model a desirable model? If it is, how would it work? How would it work very locally at Emory? We really, in the end, boiled down to kind of how would we actually institutionalize it on the ground. Our group was a very small group. We didn't try, we have about 540 faculty. We did not try to involve all of them. We actually didn't try to involve most of them. I thought the best way to get at these questions was to put together a group of people who could really spend some time being educated that would represent a variety of disciplines, a variety of different positions, and see what kind of conclusions we could reach together. I was Executive Associate Dean at the time, which was a great title because nobody knew what it meant. We brought in the Center for Digital Scholarship. We had the Director of Scholarly Communications in the library. We had a faculty member who was Director of our Humanities Center. We had a couple of department chairs. We had some junior faculty, some assistant professors. Some of these people had some experience with digital publication, but many of them did not, and that was also very, very purposeful. And I think we had a good time. We spent about 6 months. We brought in consultants from university presses to talk to them about how they were experiencing the things we were talking about. We had presentations from different groups on campus. We learned a lot about what was going on in the landscape of academic publishing. And in the end, we produced a kind of white paper. And I would say the top line, headline of this white paper, which I'm happy to send, or it's available, open access, of course, on the web, is that we ended up actually endorsing this model and thinking really hard about why it would work, why it would be a good thing, and also how it would work. And I think what felt like a key insight for us, which maybe doesn't seem so radical when you put it up on a slide, on a screen this side, but it felt radical at the time, was thinking about the future of scholarship in the humanities is not about moving the print monograph to all one thing, right? That we are entering into a moment when the scholarly products in the humanities will actually be many things. What we started thinking of as the monograph might actually be better described as long-form scholarship. And when we say we didn't go into different things, we didn't mean just go into articles. We mean surviving as long-form scholarship, but in different forms. So, for instance, we actually don't think, and I don't think print monographs are going away anytime soon, nor do I think they necessarily should go away. I think for many faculty, for many projects, a print monograph is going to work particularly fine for the foreseeable future. We have many faculty who, for instance, want to publish trade monographs. There's no reason necessarily that model isn't working for them. In many cases, the print monograph is going to be a perfectly functional form for distributing and disseminating project. However, for many reasons, I'll say a little bit more, I think for an increasing number of faculty, another point on the continuum that will be attractive is publishing something that very much looks like a print book in a digital form, right? Something that actually, could be a print monograph, but there are advantages to publishing it digitally through a university press. We might think about a next stop on the continuum is bullet point 3, long-form scholarship published digitally that's substantially enhanced, right? Something that looks a lot like a book, but does some things, incorporates sound files or lots of hyperlinks to archives, or things like that that you can only do in a digital form. So there might be a print version, but it will be a less enhanced version of the print of the digital object. And then there are going to be projects, including things that do the same kind of work of monographs, that are digitally published long-form scholarship that really could not be attempted or have any kind of analog in print form. And obviously there's lots of different stops along this continuum, but sort of thinking about the future of scholarship as being many things along, points along this line was very helpful for us as faculty, and I still do think of myself as a faculty member, rather than thinking about the entire corpus of scholarly output in the humanities making a transition to one thing or one model for either production or distribution. So we came to some conclusions. I'll just mention some of the ones in bold. First, we actually talk at length in the report that as humanists, we still believe that should be a high premium on long-form scholarship. The monograph is really critical to how humanists think, present arguments, advance scholarly questions. The work that we do as scholars requires that kind of capaciousness of thinking. We also very strongly ended up endorsing open access publication as an ideal. And the reason I want to mention that is this also doesn't seem that radical at all. But if you had come to the first meeting of our working group, you'd have thought there was no way we were going to get there. There was suspicion. There was an association of open access with a lesser than scholarship. There were questions about why give it away for free, devaluing. I'm sure you've all heard versions of this at some point in your scholarly lives. But really the group came around to this as being very much in line with their set of principles as scholars and as scholarly citizens. And I think that was a very important transition. We did talk about how we would do this and should it be open to faculty of just some ranks. We were talking about this morning with some group. We really came up strongly that we wanted it to be open to faculty of all ranks, not just junior scholars, not just senior scholars. And we do have concerns about preservation and discoverability, right? Those are concerns that are not new. I'm sure any of you who work in the library know about the concerns about digital scholarship in that way. And then the last, bold point, one of the things we realized at the end, and I'll say more about what we're doing now toward this end, is we realized we had spent 6 months thinking about these things, and so we had reached a set of conclusions, but that our poor benighted colleagues who had not spent 6 months, who had happily gone on doing other kinds of things, had not. And that anything that we're going to do in this way will take time and education, right? The life of a faculty member does not involve sitting around and thinking about changes to the academic publishing landscape, nor should it. Because if we all sat around and just thought about this all the time, none of the teaching and research would actually get done. So how are we going to think about socializing this model? When I've talked about this report, I frequently receive this question, well, what about tenure? You didn't mention anything about tenure and promotion in those bullet points and conclusions. And it's interesting, actually tenure and promotion was not a big point of discussion for this group. And I'll say in part it's because we had a strategic advantage, and I think actually Brian Croxall, who's here, played a role in this. About 3 years beforehand, our Humanities Council, which is the group of chairs of humanities departments, had adopted a memo on the evaluation of digital scholarship for promotion and tenure. And then this document is now part of our College of Arts and Sciences tenure and promotion guidelines. So this document is out there. It was really conceived of as a kind of welcome mat for digital scholars, for people pursuing digital publication. It puts into, and frankly, if you read this set of guidelines, it actually doesn't say very much. It says, we're going to ask the same kinds of questions of digital scholarship that we ask of all scholarship. It says a little bit about the process. Digital scholarship needs to be evaluated in its native format. It may require additional external evaluation from people familiar with the methods of digital scholarship as opposed to just the content area. But mostly what it says is that we value it and we're prepared to evaluate it as fairly and rigorously as we do any other form of scholarship. And we think this memo will cover all the other things that we're talking about. And in a way, this kind of took that question off the table, at least in the working group. Now, this is a memo that's kind of more theoretical than practical at this moment. We haven't had really any tenure cases that have rested on the evaluation of digital scholarship in the College of Arts and Sciences yet. It really is a welcome act for the faculty we'd like to hire rather than the faculty we necessarily have. Not to say that, especially since it's being recorded, not that we're unhappy with the faculty we have. If there are any Emory faculty listening in. But this document did help. It's modeled on other documents from other universities. It's not revolutionary in any way. Nothing we're doing is revolutionary in any way. I believe in, taking good ideas that other people have and borrowing from them. So why did we end up endorsing open access monographs? These are ideas that you're probably familiar with, but let me just point out some of the most salient arguments among our faculty. One is the high cost of monographs, right? Our faculty in the humanities are frustrated because they put their years of life into a book and it comes out from a press that they admire and it's priced at $95. And it shows up in very few libraries as a result, and even fewer hands of the scholars that they want to be in dialogue with. So the idea of having a product that is actually available at a much lower price point, namely free, is something that's attractive. There is a strong interest in global readership. One of the most influential and interestingly eloquent members of our working group was an assistant professor who works on Islam in Indonesia, who said, I'm in dialogue with these scholars in Indonesia. Getting my scholarship into their hands is a kind of ethical imperative for me. And this is a vehicle by which I could do that. And I think this is something that really is important, both for faculty who work in international fields and for those of us who aspire to be part of an international research community. There's concerns as well about domestic library purchases. I don't need to tell anybody in this room about how the cost of scientific journals have driven down book buying budgets, especially at universities with that are state funded or small liberal arts colleges. Again, I feel like this is a point that this room will understand very well. And then there is also excitement and interest about the incorporation of digital artifacts. People working in film and media, people working in music, people working in art history. I will say there are strong concerns about rights issues, permissions issues that are not surmounted by any stretch of the imagination at this point. But I think that is something that is really exciting to people as a possibility. So we actually did boil down to how this model would work. What if we had a pot of money that we devoted to the subvention of digital publications through university or academic presses? What would that work like? How would it look like? In our model, we suggested it be co-funded by the college and the library, mostly from the college, which is where at Emory most faculty appointments live in the humanities, but also where the money really comes from. We imagine at this point a competitive process that's open to all faculty, so faculty will apply to receive these subvention funds, and that a committee will review requests, and that the quality of scholarship was paramount. When I say we're imagining a competitive process, in part, this process of a committee review and a competition is as much at this point to ensure the quality of the press's product and the ways that presses are treating the publication as it is about the quality of the scholarly work. We want to make sure, especially, that if university presses are publishing our faculty's works, and we're paying for it, that they are doing the things that we expect of any any digital monograph, and that they're also submitting it to the same kind of peer review process that they submit any monograph. So we're actually going to ask to see the peer reviews, not so that we can second guess them or weigh in on them, but so we can ensure that it's done. So we have a list of things, a wish list of things that we would like to see in digital monographs. Interestingly, this meeting that Harriet and I were at in August, we talked about a kind of multi-school initiative to support the publication of digital monographs, open access digital monographs, and came up with a list of things we'd like to see among institutions, and it's pretty much the same list. Right, robust peer review and marketing and design, all the things that university presses are good at. And this is one question, is why are we so interested in continuing to work with university presses? University presses are really good at producing wonderful books, at designing them, at marketing them, at getting them in the hands of the right readers. We think that they're going to continue to be incredibly important partners, and of course they also are arbiters of a peer review process that is important to the promotion and tenure and to the tenure process. We also do like the idea of, when possible, and that's why there's an asterisk here, of having a print version available. I don't think that's something we'll necessarily insist upon, especially for those works where it doesn't make sense, but I think at this moment it continues to be desirable. So we wrote this report. Since then, as I mentioned, there is now this multi-institutional initiative of which Emory is part, of which Brown is part, to try to support this model and roll it out. I think we're also trying to figure out what this initiative is between universities, but so far so good, right? I think it basically is this kind of statement of principles that we like this model and want to work for it. We are now in the process of starting a new grant, again funded by the Mellon Foundation, again modeled in some ways off of the grant that you're working with here, where we're trying to build the infrastructure to allow our faculty to take advantage of this. So what does this mean? This means we need to engage in faculty education. We need to engage in graduate student education, right? We need to make sure that both faculty and graduate students are aware of these changes in the academic landscape and figure out how to communicate with faculty early enough in the process that they can be thinking about these options before they actually come to a completed manuscript. We do need to provide digital scholarship support. We imagine that some of these projects will have a digital scholarly element, right, where they're creating a digital artifact that will become part of the publication. And we imagine at this point that we'll be working with our Digital Scholarship Center to do that. So the grant includes funding for that. And it also includes funding for staff members who will coordinate and carry on this work. And especially a key position for us that I've talked about earlier today is we are searching for, and I think nearly completed, a search for somebody who, this is impossible to read, who is the title Senior Associate Director for Publishing in the Humanities, which is what we negotiated with HR. Somebody who will be located in our Center for the Humanities, whose work will be to be a kind of liaison between faculty and university presses as these new initiatives are being rolled out. Where we live at this moment, I think, in terms of this process, is we're at a kind of chicken and egg moment, where the university presses are asking the question about whether or not they should be investing in infrastructure for digital publications because they don't know how much faculty interest there's going to be. The faculty want to know whether or not the presses they're interested in publishing with have the infrastructure to support this kind of digital publication. We're trying to grease the wheels a little bit. And this particular staff person, it will not be his or her responsibility to do all of the wheel greasing, but it'll be his or her responsibility to do a little of it, to help educate faculty, to bring university press editors to our campus who might be involved in these new initiatives, to help go to university presses and help understand what models might be right for the faculty that we have on the ground and their projects. You know, one of the things that we're really trying to do as we work on this is to think of this as a form of faculty support, right? That this is about helping our faculty understand the options that are available to them so that their scholarship can have the most impact. We are not trying to create a model where we force all of our faculty or even strongly incentivize all of our faculty to go one particular way or another. Not at this moment. This is really sort of how can we build the tools that will allow our faculty to make the best choices for themselves and their scholarly projects. All politics are very local. All academic politics are local. And so in our institutional context, this means working among some institutional players that have not always connected as well institutionally as we would like. That's not to say they've not, you know, that they're enemies, sworn enemies or anything like that, but this does mean forging some partnerships on campus. So like I said, most of this grants work will be located in our Center for Humanistic Inquiry. We locate it there because it is seen as a locus of support for faculty and graduate students in the humanities, but they're going to have to work very closely with Emory Libraries and our Center for Digital Scholarship. Our Center for Digital Scholarship is both sort of in but not of the library. That's a separate talk, but we need to be able to work very closely with them. And then the administration of the College of Arts and Sciences. Again, we have a very decentralized school structure. I would not necessarily say that these are the same institutional players that have to play well at all campuses to make this happen, but this is what our local administrative landscape looks like. There are still, you know, I think a lot of questions to answer about the future of all of this. So we have a 4-year grant to kind of launch this. We're hoping, you know, we're of course hoping it's successful, but we imagine it will be a process that will actually continue for many more years in terms of thinking about how we support faculty and how we think about the scholarship that goes on in the humanities and how that scholarship is both produced and disseminated. Some of the questions that we're thinking about for the future, that I'm thinking about for the future, is what will be, you know, the effect of this shift in funding in very material ways, right? What does it mean when universities start providing in a different way more funding for the production costs of a monograph? And I think there are both risks and rewards in that possibility. One of the things that's interesting at this moment is, in some senses, the university has always provided a large amount of funding for an academic monograph, because of course we provide the salary that allows the person to write it. But universities as institutions very rarely have a seat at the table in terms of the negotiation about how that monograph is marketed, distributed, priced, and so on. This could change that relationship between the universities where scholars reside and the presses that publish their work. A big and interesting question for me is, will scholars write for different audiences? And as I think about this myself, I could see this actually pulling in very opposite and maybe equally valuable directions. On the one hand, because open access monographs are, of course, available to the general public, it may encourage scholars to change the way they write and argue and think about that public audience. At the same time, it may also, and I don't mean this in any pejorative sense at all, help sustain forms of scholarly communities that in fact are very esoteric. Right? One of the things the internet does do is it brings together communities across the globe that in fact are not very large in terms of raw numbers, and that probably couldn't be sustained in any other way. It's possible that what the digital publication does is actually creates a kind of bimodal effect. It's also possible that it's not, well, it won't do any of these things. This is, you know, November of 2016 is not a good time to be doing predictions. And then will the monograph itself change, right? Right now, the monograph, as we think about it, is, you know, a certain number of pages, about 180 to about 300 pages without notes. It looks about the same. There are a certain number of chapters. Could books get longer? Could they get shorter? Could they stop looking less like books? Those questions seem to me up for grabs. And again, I think sort of how we think about that and what exactly is going to happen is something that's going to be, the result of a complex system. It's not necessarily going to be one thing or another, and I'll say again, we are in this kind of chicken and egg moment. We are priming the pump. And I also will say I don't think administrators are going to determine any of it, right? That we can help provide some funding, but I think if we try to plan out exactly how this is all going to look, we'll get it badly wrong. What's interesting to me at this moment is how these different models of digital open access publication are emerging. And I'm just going to give 3 examples of different university press initiatives. And I'm guessing many of you in this room are familiar with all of these, or at least some of these. But it's interesting to think about the 3 of them together. So the University of California Press has the Luminos Project. Has everybody heard about the Luminos Project? There's a few nods. Luminos is an open access monograph project by the University of California Press. It's now open to all faculty. I believe it started just for University of California faculty, which of course is an immense faculty. And it produces digital monographs. And here's a book by a Cornell archaeologist on ancient Persian archaeology of empires. This is a book that, from what I can tell, the limited amount I know about Near Eastern archaeology, seems very, I don't want to say it's traditional, it sounds like might be a bad thing, but very much in line with what one expects of a monograph of this kind. As you can see, you can either download the book as an EPUB, you can read the book through a web interface, or you can buy a paperback version, which is priced about the same as other University of California publications. So if you go to the web interface, it looks very much like any other book. These are some web pages that I just pulled up. These are some screenshots from random, right? It looks like almost like a PDF. You can do some things here you can't do with a print book. There's a tab where you can search. The notes are hyperlinked to each other. So it's got a little enhancement, but not very much, right? This is the stop on the continuum where the web version looks a lot like a print version. Luminos says, and we're bringing one of the Luminos editors to campus in January, that they have some projects in the pipeline that take more advantage of the digital environment than what they've done so far. But at this point, these are largely things that look like print books. Here's an EPUB version, like you might read on your iPad or your Kindle or something like that. And so here's an EPUB, here's a web interface. It doesn't look that much different. And they're also selling the print book. And one of the interesting things is that, according to what they've said, the University of California Press has said, is that the print sales for these books published in Luminos to this time are just as strong as they would expect for any print book in their list. In other words, print sales so far don't decline if you also publish an open access digital version. Could that change in the future? Possibly. I don't know. They don't know. They're getting off the ground, and I think it's really interesting. I mentioned before the Manifold Project at the University of Minnesota Press and CUNY. This is a really interesting project, a different kind of platform. Some of you in the room are probably very familiar with this book that kind of really launched this platform, or was the pilot for this platform, called Debates in Digital Humanities. This is a very different kind of model of a digital publication. So you see there's a book here, but you can also leave comments and annotate the work as you go through and read it. And then the idea is that this platform allows for that kind of annotation and commentary, and then at certain moments there will be new editions that are updated. So this is a more labor-intensive process. For some scholars, this is really exciting to be in kind of continual dialogue with the audience. For some scholars, this sounds like a nightmare. It is a continuation. We were talking earlier with some faculty about labor, faculty labor. Right? This requires a different kind of faculty labor, right? Because you're going to be constantly returning to book and so on. Interestingly, the other experiment that I know of like this is by a philosopher who's now dean actually involved in this initiative, who published a book like this with Cambridge. Now that was not open access, so you had to buy the book to be able to get into the digital version. But then the idea is you could leave comments, and he's a philosopher who works on Socratic dialogue. And he loved this idea that kind of he could model Socratic dialogue through the publication of the book. So Minnesota is experimenting with this platform, which is really about commentary, annotation, but also iterability, right? Projects that can be and should be released in new, and what we might think of as new editions constantly. And then, the kind of farthest point on the continuum is a project like Enchanting the Desert, which is part of the Stanford University Press. This is the first monograph published by the Stanford University Press Digital Monograph Initiative. It's by Nicholas Bach, who is a geographer. He's just started at the University of Oklahoma. This is a very interesting project, and this is the kind of thing that doesn't really have a print equivalent. It's a book in what we might think of as cultural geography. It's our subject of the book is a series of historical photographs of the Grand Canyon. Nicholas Bach is a geographer, and so he argues that these photographs, and in the context of early 20th century tourism, created certain ideas about the Grand Canyon and about landscapes that have shaped our environmental consciousness to this day. And I want to emphasize that argument because this is a project that really does have an argument and does have a narrative, argumentative arc, if you choose to follow it, in the way that a print monograph does. So you can see there are photographs and maps and text. There are things like chapters. You can see here on the left-hand side. There is, I think, about 80 or 90,000 words of text. So, if you were to print out all the words, it would look like a print monograph, but it would not be the same scholarly object at all. And so he brings, what Bach has found is that this format allows him to bring certain kinds of interpretive tools to his subject that he feels like a print monograph would not allow him to do. And of course, he was working at Stanford, which has been one of the pioneers in terms of thinking about spatial, how one thinks about spatial computing, spatial analysis in computing. And it's a very interesting project if you just want to go and have fun with it, because you can navigate it in all kinds of different ways. He's built in all kinds of things in terms of looking at view sheds, looking at historic photographs, looking at geography and topography, and you can read it straight through as a series of chapters, or you can choose a very different way of navigating it if you want. So here's a kind of, here on this left you see the table of contents, so you can sort of go straight through like you would with a print book, but that's certainly not the only way to navigate it. The thing I want to call attention to, and this will be as I move to a conclusion here, is something really interesting, a kind of almost throwaway detail that you might miss. So when you go to Enchanting the Desert and its homepage, which I encourage you to do, what you see on the right here is a series of project statements. And I'm sure most of you won't be able to read this. There's actually a series of audiences. So geographers, artists, enthusiasts, digital humanists, and everyone. In a way, this is not entirely radical, right? Lots of us in our introductions, we might be working at an intersection of multiple disciplines, and we might say, well, if you're a women's studies scholar, you're going to be interested in these things. If you're interested in the history of psychoanalysis, you're going to be interested in these things. If you're interested in literature, you're going to be interested in these things. But this feels very different, right? On the front page, Nicholas Bach has decided to really think about and solicit the different kinds of audiences that might be coming to this project, including non-academic audiences. One of the things he's found in his research is that there's a group of people who are really just Grand Canyon aficionados. Now, I actually wrote about historical aficionados for my project on Custer, so I have a great deal of affection to the amateur historians. But he thought about how would they relate to this project? How would people who are not interested in geography or the Grand Canyon at all, but are interested in digital humanities, relate to this project? How would artists who are interested in the history of photography relate to this project? And he kind of puts that out there on the front page as a kind of welcome mat for those different audiences. And when I think about that, I do think about this sense that it's possible for us to be thinking about the ways in which our scholarship engages the public in different kinds of ways. There's this line in Kant where he talks about the person of reason is a scholar, right? That scholarship is for everyone who possesses the facility of reason. And that's a kind of old Enlightenment ideal that reason can reach the public and the citizenry and enlighten it and improve society and so on. And in some ways it feels old-fashioned, it feels outdated, and at the same time it also feels incredibly necessary to our enterprise, to our mission as scholars, as global citizens, as people who do want to transform the world through what we do. Do I think digital humanities, digital scholarship can do all of that? No, that would be ridiculous. But I do think that it's possible that these new modes of publication could change how we think about the relationship between those of us who are inside the academy to those of us who are outside the academy. And I suspect that will be unpredictable and have many, many bumps in the road, but I hope in the long run could be also really exciting. So thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about any of this, all of this, and just open it up for discussion. Yeah.
I find the content of the presentation ignores like a long list of fundamental issues and is in large measure flawed. Online stuff is wonderful. I've designed interactive online databases statewide, certain things you can do, but you don't talk about so many things that are important. For instance, I was looking at the Desert website and your ad for the assistant person or whatever the job title was. The one on your website, 10 lines averaged over 18 words in a line. The Desert one was between 20 and 25 words in a line. We've known for decades this isn't going to change till people die, that you can't have more than about 12 words in a line, or else you get so far down you don't know where to start when you come back. Almost everything I saw here was poorly designed. You also have the fact that there's a huge wave in the country of what's called computer vision syndrome. So many people reading on screens of any kind, whether it's a laptop or a large Mac or whatever it is. A PC has 96 dots, pixels per inch, a Mac 72. A book is 3 or 6 or 9 or 1200 DPI. More reading digitally is not healthy. It's a great thing, it's not going to go away, but it's actually not healthy for the eye. If you watch a movie and you see a computer screen or a TV, you see the flickering and so forth. You don't have that in a printed book. So while I'm all for online access and stuff like that, there are severe, to be honest with you, the bottom line of the whole presentation is here's a way we can save money. Okay, how do we justify it, and how does it make sense? Money seems to be a driving force with this argument. for example, Stanford was brought up many times. Stanford and Princeton in 2014 completed a major study that definitively showed that students who handwrite notes retain the information. People who keyboard notes retain it at most 24 hours. Now, while it's all great and good to annotate PDFs, and I'm so glad that Apple and Adobe have so much money, the fact is that the information is not retained as much. You know, the list goes on, you know, in terms of some of these, you know, issues that are perforce brought up in this. I mean, one could debate them. Also, academics is inbred enough as it is. You know, a university or a college publishing its own faculty. I mean, that's dangerous. I myself have dealt with 2 Harvard scholars who dominated scholarship in one area for the 20th century. And it's horrible what between them and their grad students were able to affect in terms of actively suppressing information. It comes out if you go back and...
But let me just stop you there.
Yes,
First of all, I think, you know, you're absolutely right about we probably will have to change the design of information on the screens. I don't think that's going to be particular to book publishing or to the humanities, right? This is some of these things you're talking about. I don't know whether we're going to ever get away from reading on screens. Again, I'm not that much of a futurologist or a technology person. The fact is, we are reading on screens, as you point out. I will say to your point about students writing on documents, one of the things that our group would like to see is that, in fact, you can print these things out, especially for classroom teaching. We have lots of people who are, one of the exciting things about spreading scholarship and making it available is to be able to get it into classrooms. But I think you're right that students read better when they read on paper and be able to take notes on a physical paper. I think that's something we know.
But here you print out on very poor quality paper, very low resolution.
I can't.
And low.
I can't solve the paper problems too.
Yeah.
But let me get to a large one. It's actually not about saving money. It's really nothing I've said here is going to save any money. It may change where the money comes from, and it may change how we distribute the money. I mean, it is in a sense. We are trying to take something that could become unsustainable, academic publishing, and sustain it. But in fact, what we're talking about is shifting the cost, not actually reducing the money. And I will say, I'll also own to, there is a danger with that as well that I didn't talk about. So for all the flaws that you found, let me throw out another one that concerns me and concerns the faculty that I work with is, one of the things we are doing is we're increasing the costs of hiring a humanities scholar. As somebody who works in the dean's office, my job is to save money because I work for the students as well. But one of the dangers is there's already a divide between institutions that can support research scholars in the humanities and those that don't have the resources to do so. And are we in danger of widening that divide further? And that's something that we've talked about in the institutional group that Harriet and I are part of, and something that we've talked about internally at Emory. And I don't have a good answer for that. I do think it's something that we should be thinking about. One of the advantages, and I think wonderful features about scholarship in the humanities that is distinct from, say, the natural sciences, is that it is a more level playing field for scholars at different institutions. Now, I want to say, I'm saying it very carefully, right? More level, not level, right? If you're teaching 6 courses a semester, it seems impossible that you're going to write a book, but it is theoretically possible. If you can't get funding for a lab, right, it is literally impossible to do your work in the natural sciences. And I would hate for us to move entirely in the direction where you have to be at a university that has these kinds of resources in order to publish. So that's another concern that I have. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation and bringing up all of these questions and concerns around the future of the humanities monograph and where it's going in terms of digital platforms. One of the things that I'm intrigued by, right, is this relationship between the university and the publishers, right, and the university presses. And it's not necessarily between the university and that university's book.
Right.
And my sense is at this point there are only a handful of university presses that are in this game at this point.
I think that's, although we've seen a questionnaire, Harriet and I, that suggested that a number of presses are ready to get into this game.
Okay. And
We'll see. But you're right. At this moment, it's kind of about.
Because one of the things that I'm not quite able to put my finger on it is that something about that relationship sounds like what we hear from our politicians about public-private partnerships. I'm not quite sure whether the analogy is there, but how that relationship is going to develop and which of these university presses are going to be the big fish, right? Whether it's Stanford and the UC, and that may not be really good for someone who's an Ugaritic scholar, right? And they need to publish with some Dutch, right? There's only so I'm wondering if that relationship is already going to undermine the applicability of this to only certain people in certain kinds of fields within the humanities.
I think that's a really good question. I wonder the same thing as well. I'm hopeful that it won't, but I think that's a concern as well. And I guess one of the things that's important is that actually the biggest academic publishers, Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press, are not in this game yet. They're entering into, Cambridge is kind of entering into an open access model, but it's not really it doesn't seem, at least from my perception, doesn't seem to be playing with the other presses that are kind of really thinking about this work together. What is interesting is that some smaller presses are. So University of Michigan Press has really been thinking this through, and there's some other small presses. But I think that's a legit concern, especially given the fact those presses are under pressure already. So if this becomes another thing that they have to do and they don't have financial resources to do that, is this going to be possible? On the other hand, if they can be certain that there are certain X number of faculty who are interested in doing these kinds of works with them at X number of dollars a project, that creates a certainty of revenue for them that might actually help sustain their futures. So, the answer is I don't really know what the end game of this is going to be. It's interesting when this whole model was when I first heard it, I thought that it was as much about trying to sustain university presses as it was about anything else. But I don't know what that is actually going to look like in the long run. I do think, as somebody who, so I was Dean of Faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences, Senior Associate Dean for Faculty, not to inflate my title, for 5 years, which meant we have a subvention fund at Emory for our faculty who need subventions, and those came through my office. And so it's true that at some point I realized, this is very interesting. The presses ask us for some money, and usually a couple $1,000, sometimes more for art books. And we, of course, the scholars' work that we've supported for years through travel and salary and archival work and library purchases is a big part of what goes into this product. But I never felt like I could or should or even wanted to pick up the phone and say, make sure you keep this book under $30, or if I give you another $1,000, could you keep this book under $30? So on the positive side, I think developing more. I guess it was part of this what I'd say as a faculty member when you're publishing a book, right? You do this if things are going well. You do this maybe once every 5 years. once every 10 years. You don't know what you're doing in terms of negotiating. I certainly, every time I've published a book, and there's only been a couple, I've just been delighted to be able to sign anything. So one of the things that this could do is help develop a little bit more in-house expertise on the faculty side through college administrations or university administrations or wherever it resides, and help make it more of a dialogue. I've already, I'll tell you myself, through this process, learned a lot just by having a bunch of meetings where I sit down with university press editors, where I'm not trying to pitch my own project, which is a very different kind of meeting, but actually trying to understand the pressures that they're dealing with and how they're thinking about these things. So I guess I'm a little bit hopeful about that piece. I don't think I answered any part of your question, except to say, I hope you're right. I hope that your concern is something that is addressed by a sufficient number of publishers getting into this game. And I think it's actually going to be critical for its success if it's going to become more than a kind of boutique project, because faculty are prestige-driven creatures, and myself among them, and we want to publish with the presses that are considered prestigious in our field, where we can, we're in the company of other authors that we imagine ourselves to be peers with. And we know that that is going to be crucial to our professional advancement. And so the presses being able to be of sufficient variety to cover the bulk of the humanities, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, this may be irrelevant to you, but you've spoken a great deal about university presses. I'm wondering if you have any comments about the ill-fated reprint publishing business, which flourished in the last half of the 20th century, but pretty much doesn't exist anymore.
Do you mean reprints of like literary works and things like that? Things like I haven't thought a lot. One of the interesting things that is happening is that university presses are using this, even ones that have not introduced this open access model for new works, are putting out their backlists in open access versions. Cornell has done this for some of their works, and Yale is involved in a big project to do this. And I think that could be really exciting, maybe a model that others will follow. The Yale project is especially interesting because they're trying to figure out how to do it for art books. And so they're actually creating, as I understand it, somebody in the room might know more about this than I do, a digital viewer that they think will be better for art books to get at some of the design issues that the gentleman raised before.
Your file size is an issue with this
Exactly.
project, and you come to something like art, because what's sufficient online is not sufficient
Exactly.
in print.
And to go further, they're working on the permissions issues, and permissions issues I do see is, Don Waters from the Mellon Foundation once said, what we really need to do is to get all the major rights holders in a room and make them lock the door until we can come up with an agreement. Rights issues are going to be a
Well, of course, reprint publishers could avoid that by taking things out of copyright, which
Right.
is what they essentially did.
Right, but if they involve visual images where the copyright doesn't expire, then they have to go back and clear copyright again if they're going to reprint.
Well, I was a reprint publisher myself, and I added introductions by scholars, and all those books have since been digitized by whomever,
Right.
without asking my permission, because they didn't need to, but they took my books and used them for their purposes and left out the introductions.
It's terrible. I mean, I will say, I think this could lead to a much more ethical system of that kind.
Just a quick question on distribution. So how are these going to be marketed and
Great-
distributed?
great question.
Does every library just put a link to them in their catalogs, and then they're sort of stamped with the seal of approval?
That's a really good question, and that's not something but that is, that's one of the reasons libraries are really important partners with us. And actually, one of the biggest pieces that needs to be addressed is the kind of is the distributors, right? University presses, and if you work in the library, you know them better than I do, right? Rely on those distributors to help understand what's going to be possible, what to collect, and there's no model for that for these digital monographs. So how are we going to do that? And I actually don't know the answer to that myself, but that is a big deal, and that's why libraries are going to be part of this partnership as it goes forward.
But won't the negative outfall of this be that book buying will go down? I mean, Brown's collection is so atrophied, to the point of mediocrity. In other words, I don't care whose toes I step
Sure.
on.
You've already made that clear.
You go to truth will out, as Shakespeare said. You go to find almost anything that's been published in recent years. Harvard has it. Brown does not have it. It's disturbing.
Well, I obviously can't speak to that. I do think it is possible, right? If books are distributed digitally, those books, some libraries may choose not to get them. At the same time, the number of libraries, as you say, that are declining, right, that are no longer purchasing monographs in the humanities has already diminished to the point where the standard for print run for a first book in the humanities is something like 150 or 200 copies. So obviously, I would like to see libraries continue to purchase the print editions as well, but this is already kind of moving in that direction.
So Michael, thank you. I especially want to say how much I admire the work that you're doing at Emory. Brown also has a very similar project, more focused on the digital iteration than the kind of open access publishing focus and so on. I think the whole point is that this is a time of experimentation and exploration. And as many people have pointed out, what we've seen, the examples we've seen, are not finished products. They are the beginning of what could be. And all of these issues that you've raised and that you outlined early in your presentation are questions there. They're not answers, really. And so it takes a kind of bravery to move forward in this landscape and to be part of the change rather than to be simply observers or potentially obstructionists. So thank you very much for the presentation, and there may be additional questions that if you have the strength, maybe a small sandwich or something, join me in thanking you. Thank you very much.